I'd like to thank you all for coming to this Conversations with Writers event from the Off the Page reading series. We are delighted and proud today to present a reading from QC alumna Ava Chin, and then afterwards she will be in conversation with QC President Frank H. Wu. We are very, very honored to have them both here. Ava Chin is the author of the award-winning Eating Wildly and Mott Street, which was named a Best Book of 2023 by Time, the San Francisco Chronicle, Kirkus Reviews, and Elle, and appeared in the 2024 American Library Association's Notable Books list. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Village Voice, Spin, and Vibe. She is the recipient of fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, the Fulbright Program, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the New York Institute for the Humanities, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. She received a PhD from the University of Southern California, an MA from Johns Hopkins, and a BA from right here in the English department at Queens College. She's a professor of creative nonfiction at the College of Staten Island and the CUNY Graduate Center, where she is the head of the American Studies Certificate Program. Frank H. Wu serves as the 11th president of Queens College. He was a member of the faculty at Howard University, the nation's leading historically Black college university, for a decade. Frank is the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. Prior to his academic career, he held a clerkship with the late U.S. District Judge Frank J. Battisti in Cleveland and practiced law with the firm of Morrison and Forster in San Francisco. He received a BA from the Johns Hopkins University and a JD with honors from the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating event. And please welcome QC alumna Ava Chin and QC President Frank H. Wu.
All right, so who says you can't ever come back home again, right? It is such a pleasure to be here. I spent so many years in the English department at QC. In fact, I remember when Clapper was a brand new building. So that says something. We will be talking a bit about how I started to write this book, the impetus for it. But I'm going to presume that folks haven't had a chance to read it yet, although I know that there are some people in the audience who have. But I really want to just emphasize how thrilled I am to be here with you, to be standing here in my middle age, kind of looking back at versions of myself, my much younger self. So it's really thrilling that there are undergrads here at QC. How many of you are undergrads here? Okay, and how many of you are graduate students, out of curiosity? Okay, mostly, yes. We're all grad students at heart, former grad students at heart, right, John? So this is a book that really did get its genesis from the classes that I took here at Queens College. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but I first want to tell you a little bit about myself. And I'm a fifth generation Chinese American New Yorker. I'm descendant from a Chinese railroad worker, so big ups to him for that work that he did in the late 19th century and the 1860s. And I discovered that, these stories when I was growing up really captured my imagination. What I noticed is that a lot of these stories weren't reflected back to me in the literature that I was reading when I was growing up. At the same token, I'm also raised by a single mother. And I did not know my father when I was growing up, including when I was an undergraduate here. And when I was an undergrad in the English department where I was studying creative writing, one of my fiction writers, when he learned that I grew up not knowing my dad, and I didn't know him, indeed I hadn't met him at that time, said to me, "Ava, that is the wound that made you a writer." And this was the kind of thing that I thought about for many, many years, and it stuck with me, right? And writers often think, well, what happened in your life that made you a writer, right? So for many years, because my professor had said this, and I love this professor, by the way. Yeah, I was his research assistant when I was in undergrad. He's no longer here. He's long retired. But for the longest time, I thought that that was the reason that made me a writer. It was only after writing this book and doing decades of research that I realized actually the wound of my father walking out was not the only thing that made me a writer, right? And I'm gonna go back to this by the end of our conversation. Okay, so I wanna just read you, tell you sort of the story. I started collecting a lot of these stories while I was an undergraduate here, collecting stories from my family members because of those two things. Number one, not seeing the stories that I thought needed to be told, that were told in my family, but I didn't see it reflected in our literature. I knew that was one impetus for being a writer, right? The other was, who was this family that I was estranged from? All I knew was that my dad and his family were bigwigs in Chinatown. But what did that even mean, right? And the family that I knew, by the time I was born, hated my father. And it turned out my parents actually never talked to each other after my dad split. They only spoke to each other through each other's lawyers. So for many years as a kid, I grew up wanting to understand who I was in relation to this family and who they were in relation to each other. And I think as a nonfiction writer, I was continuously thinking, well, what is the larger story at work? And I'm going to just sort of describe to you on the first day that I met my father. I first saw my father as a pair of feet in Italian leather shoes, bounding down the carpeted staircase of his office building on one of the oldest streets in Chinatown. It was a cold, rainy, late afternoon in mid-February. This is 27 years ago. When I arrived only 10 minutes before, I stood at the threshold hesitating. On the door, on the side, was a buzzer with my father's name on it. This building was a building in Chinatown that I had passed numerous times before. And I was trying to stay calm and take deep, even breaths. I had never hidden anything this big from the family who raised me, but I had been waiting my entire life for this moment. And finally, I pushed the buzzer. Now, this building that I was standing in front of was actually the oldest row house in all of Manhattan. And it was certainly the oldest building in Chinatown. It's really right on the edge of Chinatown. And again, I had passed by this building numerous times before and never realized that my father had an office there, right? Suddenly, when the doors were flung open, I saw this small face with a thin, protective smile carefully peering down at me. I had the sensation that I was meeting someone very familiar, yet very odd. It was rather like being studied from across time and down the long end of an old unfolding telescope. This was my father. And in that moment, as he stared at me, I knew that I needed to be perfect, even if it meant that I had to contort myself into someone completely unrecognizable, someone who spoke softly and reasonably, who wasn't loud and impossible, an A-plus Asian daughter with perfect emotional pitch who wouldn't scare him away with her anger or give him cause to push her away. The thought of my father rejecting me all over again made the surface of my skin buzz like glass just before the cracks appear. So we went upstairs to his office and we talked for a while, and we talked for so long about what he had done, the person that he was. My dad was one of Chinatown's first lawyers. He became one of the first wannabe politicians who wanted to represent the neighborhood and the entire Lower East Side and in the state assembly, right? So these were things that he was searching for, and I was asking him lots and lots of questions because I was really trying to understand this person that I'd always wanted to know. And later, we were talking for so long that he was decided, like, let's go have dinner, right? And so we walked out on the streets of Chinatown, and he said to me, "You see that store over there? That's where we had Chinatown's first coffee shop. That's what we ran. You see that store over there, that basement over there? That's, when I was a kid, that was an opium den." And then he pointed straight up the block towards a red brick, 6-story apartment building that seemed to flank the entire neighborhood. And he said, "Do you see that window over there? That's where your gongong and pawpaw, that's where they used to live, right? And you see that building over there, that window over there, that's where your great-grandparents used to live." So all of a sudden, I learned, just in that moment, that this building that I had passed by numerous times before actually housed generations of the side of my family that I had most wanted to connect with. As I stood there, I realized that this building held the key to something just much more than just our family. I discovered that the other side of my family also lived in that building. And that, in fact, my mother's side of the family was upstairs neighbors from my father's downstairs family, right? This family, again, that I'd only ever heard, I've never seen in the same room together. And by the time I was born, they'd only ever spoken to each other through each other's lawyers, had in fact gone to the same churches, attended the same schools, summered together out on the Jersey Shore, right? Belonged to the same Boy Scout troops, right? And had actually eaten dinner at each other's homes and apartments long before I was born. Then I discovered, as I was doing the research, and again, this is only a couple of years after I graduated from Queens College, what I discovered is that there was this overarching apparatus that existed called the Chinese Exclusion Act laws. This was our country's first immigration restrictions, right? The first ever immigration restrictions that we had. Prior to that, our borders were entirely open, right? And so when this legislation was passed in the 19th century, and it lasted for over 60 years, both sides of my family were subject to these immigration restrictions and had to learn how to navigate them. And so that's when I realized that, in fact, this book was not just about my family. It was about something much larger that impacted both the Chinese American diaspora in this country, as well as touched upon American history today. So with that, I am going to sit down and have a conversation with President Wu. Thank you.
All right, testing. Okay, great. And of course, do call me Frank. What a great book. It really is 2 stories. It's an individual memoir, and it's a history of Chinese Americans going back 150 years. And these 2 stories are united through family. So tell us more about how this book came about. And specifically, take us from your undergraduate years. There are people here who are writers who would like to write their version of this book. And how did you do the research? You're a character in the book, and you talk about, so I'll also assume people haven't read the book, but part of this, every couple chapters, Ava explains, here's what she's doing. She flies to Seattle, she goes to Salt Lake City, she does research, she talks to people. Just guide us through the research technique, because this took years, it actually took decades. And tell us a little bit about how you found the photos, because you got family photos and things like that, vintage,
yes.
Going back even more decades. So tell us about how this came about.
Sure. So the seeds of this story came about in an undergraduate literature class that I took when I was a junior here. And this literature class exposed me to many different writers of different ethnicities. They were all American writers, right? Some African American writers, some Asian American writers. And in this class, I took with our beloved Betty Weidman, who is watching on the Zoom. So she's not in the room, but she's watching this via Zoom. Hi, Betty. Shout out to you. I read Maxine Hong Kingston for the very first time in that class. And I had been a voracious reader of British and American literature ever since I was a 12-year-old girl growing up just a mile south of here, right? So I was a voracious reader. I loved immersing myself in stories. But reading Maxine Hong Kingston was the very first time I ever felt addressed as an Asian American reader. In Woman Warrior, in the beginning of the book, she says, and I don't know, Lori, if you were even in that class with me. You might have, right? Okay, so there are other Queens College alums in the house. And in this book, she says, Chinese Americans, how do you know what's really Chinese versus the movies or Your Crazy Family, right? And I thought, oh my God, that's a great question. I don't know, right? But more than that, it was this feeling of being addressed in the literature, right? In a way that I'd never been addressed before. And in her writing, she also talks about these different iterations of the restrictive immigration laws. She does it mostly in China Men, right? The follow-up to Woman Warrior. But it is the white elephant in the room, whether she actually explicitly names it or not, right? And so I was reading Maxine, and I became like completely inspired. And thank goodness that Professor Weidman decided that we could, instead of writing, we could do either a scholarly paper or we could write a piece of creative writing to go with it. And I just ran with it. What I did was I started, so I'm a junior. I think I'm maybe 20 years old at that point. I start asking questions of my family members, my grandparents. I start going through my grandmother's photo albums. My grandmother's family had come to this country in the 1880s. My grandfather's family, these are the people who raised me. He was a descendant of a railroad worker, right? There were no images of the railroad worker because he was alive in the 1860s and had passed away in China. But anyway, so there were all these stories, and people were still around, so I could ask them, right? And it was very exciting, and I photocopied a bunch of the images from my grandmother's albums. There were newspaper articles, and so I just also should say that doing this work was like impacted me a great deal. It helped strengthen my relationship with my family members, right? Because I was asking them questions about themselves. But it also sparked a fire because I thought, what else could I do, right? And so that summer, and by the way, Betty gave me an A+ on the project, okay? Thank you, Betty. I didn't even know you could get an A+, right? So that summer, there was a couple of other undergrads. One was graduating from QC, and he was going to go to do his PhD at the University of Utah. Okay, so Bruno Navarro, who is Marco's, I don't know, Marco is here, but Marco's older brother, and I went out with our friend who was moving out to Utah to go do his PhD, and we did this cross-country trip and together in a van, and we're in Salt Lake City, and I thought, the biggest genealogical library in the United States is here. This is long before the internet, long before Google, and long before Ancestry, right? And so the only way that you can really do good genealogical research in this country at that time, so this is the early 90s, was to actually go into the archive. So I went And I looked up the information as best as I could of the railroad builder, right? And I tried to trace his steps. And I actually found some information about where he was living right there, right? But I should also say that in addition to Betty's class, there were all these other classes that I was taking at the same time. And in this era of the 90s, folks were winning Ford Foundation grants. Do you remember this? To work with their undergrads, like working, I don't even know because I was an undergrad and I participated in this, but I think it was to sort of fill in a gap with, to do these seminars. I studied with Tony O'Brien for third world women literature. Debbie Geis, when she was still here, we read experimental theater. We did experimental theater techniques. I read Artaud in that class, right? So it was incredibly exciting time to be in the English department because we had all of these great opportunities as undergrads to work with our faculty here. And I remember actually in Steve Kruger's class, there was a literature of AIDS class. I don't know, were you in that class too? There were people in that class whose work we studied that I have since become friends with or have been colleagues. Sarah Schulman was a great colleague of mine who was at CSI and now she's moved. And also, I read John Weir's work in that class, right? Before John got hired. I remember I think it was in Steve's class that I became really inspired by the work of Marlon Riggs, the great Black queer filmmaker, documentarian. And one of the quotes that he said something like, and I'm paraphrasing it, but Marlon Riggs basically said, we live in a society where you understand yourself by how you're reflected in the media. And I thought, that's a call to arms because I don't really see people like me reflected in the media. I grew up in the 70s where, there were still white actors in yellowface performing as Asian people, right? And so I actually used that Marlon Riggs quote in that final paper for Betty Weidman in that class. And I want to tell you something else. So I know I'm talking a lot, but maybe you don't care because that's why you came. But anyway, so I hope. The other thing that happens is that because I've been working on this book for so many decades, and because I kind of didn't know what I was doing when I was a young person, like gathering all these materials, I was doing it all intuitively. Through the years, I moved many times. I went to Johns Hopkins at the writing seminars for my master's. Then I did a PhD at USC in Los Angeles, right? So I had several moves. And so I lost a lot of my materials in the way, or rather, I didn't know where my materials were. But by going back to the work that I did as an undergrad, I discovered that it was all in there. The bones for Mott Street were all collected in these different iterations of work that I did. So when I realized that this was a book back in 2015, I went through all of the papers that I kept it at my mother's house, right? My mother lives, just north of Union Turnpike. So I went in and I took all of my journals that I'd kept from, Queens College to all of those papers that I'd done. And it turned out that the things that I wanted were all in there, right? Including the notes that I had taken about the railroad builder when I went to Salt Lake City were in a back flap copy of Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior that I had from Betty Weidman's class. So I think the takeaway, because we all want a takeaway, right? The takeaway for you is remember that the work that you start here and now could end up being the scaffolding for the work that you do in the future. I thank undergraduate 20-year-old Ava Chin every day for the work that she did, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to write this book.
Right, right. And we are all here to listen to you talk, so
Okay.
that's fine. Thank you. So many books grow out of projects that people start early on because it's a passion. Well, let's talk more about your family. So I don't want to give away anything in the book. It's also eminently readable. It's exciting. It's got secrets. It's got scandals. So I won't give any of that away. But there are people who were police informants, people who were involved in Tong Wars. There's somebody with a big secret that you give away.
Yes.
So let's talk about, since this book is nonfiction, for anyone who writes nonfiction, who writes memoirs, one of the issues that arises is, what do the characters in the book, who are your family members, think? And I don't mean to stereotype, but even more for those from a more traditional Asian background,
Don't air the dirty laundry.
Exactly.
Don't make us look bad in front of the others.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I'm talking about? You're sort of embarrassing the family. It's shameful. I'll give you an example. This is in the first 50 pages. You use the word condom, all right? I thought to myself, do you know the sentence I'm thinking about?
I do.
Yeah. I thought to myself, wow, that's a word I would never use in front of a family member, much less about a family member.
Yeah.
So what does your family think about this? Because there are lots and lots of family members, and I assume your cousins, your half-sister or others, people have read this. Are they mad at you? Are they happy for you? Are they mad and happy? How did this go over?
The answer is all of the above. It all depends on who you ask. So there are some people who love this book. My mother, who did not like my last book, in fact, with my last book, Eating Wildly, she didn't talk to me for like 6 months after.
It won all these prizes.
It doesn't matter. When it comes to family, they don't care, right? They care about how they present in your work. So with that book, my mother didn't want to talk to me for a long time, but she got over it because I provided her only grandchild. But with Mott Street, I really didn't write that much about my mother. Right? And I'm writing about many generations before, many people who died long before I was born. And so, but still, right? My mother loved the book. My extended Chin family has loved the book. But the people who surround my father, they are not happy at all. But they also have not read the book. So I have told them, please keep an open mind, read the book. And the last person in our family who went back to our villages in China, I won a Fulbright, took the entire family back to the southern parts of China where we're from Toisan and from, Hong Kong. I'm the last person who's been there. So read the book, then talk to me after about how you feel, right? Because you need an informed opinion, right? But there are some people who will just, automatically, no, I don't like that, and because of the subject matter.
Not everyone in the book is Chinese, so there is one
True.
relative who's white, who you write about extensively.
Yes.
How did that family take it?
I actually haven't spoken to them, so I hope they're okay with it. All right, so in my grandmother's photo albums, there were giant family portraits, right? Taken, the first one was taken in the 1920s, and the other one was taken in the either late 30s, early 40s. These were black and white sepia-toned photographs that were taken in Chinatown, right? At the center of the photograph is a couple. The man is Asian, the woman is white. And these are the matriarch and patriarch of our family. I said, Grandma, who are these people? Who is that white woman? And my grandmother said, oh, that's my aunt. That's my great aunt. She actually didn't even know her name. She said, just call me Nona, right? So everybody called her Nona. So I was like, was she Italian? Was she, like, what was she, right? And it was a big mystery. All she told me, my grandmother was like, oh, she, lived in this big house with Uncle Dek Foon in Brooklyn, and, she baked big cakes. Like, it was all like this sort of random things. And it was only until a writer from the Forward newspaper, the Jewish newspaper, reached out to me and said, I should back up. I had written about Nona's husband, Uncle Dek Foon, in an online women's magazine. And a writer from the Forward newspaper read that article and reached out to me and said, your uncle was a big somebody, right? And I said, well, I knew he was a banker. I knew that he'd been profiled in the one book that was published about New York's Chinatown in the late 19th century, that all of the other books about New York City history that reference old Chinatown, they all reference this one book. And this book is called New York's Chinatown. It was by Louis Beck. It was published in 1898. And Beck profiles Uncle Dek Foon in that book. And I had a copy of the book, and I showed it to my grandmother. She was like, oh, yes. And so the great thing with family members, if you're going to do this research, which, I hope that you do, is if you kind of show them old photographs, sometimes what will happen is it will spark a memory. And so my grandmother remembered more things, and then she was like, oh, I didn't even know that about him in this profile. And I said, yes. So then so this writer contacts me, and he says, well, that because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there are files on all Chinese people who are living in America. And I said, I did not know that. So he said, do you know what Dek Foon's surname is? And I said, well, this is the family, or the Wu family, right? So put in and like Celeste's last name, right? So put that in, and we'll see it. And he found it. And at this point, for these files, there are Chinese Exclusion Act documents in the National Archives offices that are all across the country. And how you find the file is they're usually where the person lived or resided most of their lives, or it could be where the person originally landed. So many people came in, because it's Asia, they land on the West Coast, in California or in Seattle. Because I am the kind of nerdy researcher that likes to go and I need to see the documents, I need to check the watermarks, I like to feel it in my hands. I needed to go out to all of these offices, right? So I zigzagged my way across the country, and I found them, right? And with Uncle Dek Foon, he lived both in New York as well as in Boston, where he was an interpreter. His files are in 3 separate National Archives offices across the country. So you can imagine what a kind of wild hunt this was. But because I like to research, this was fun for me, right? So yes, okay, but you asked about Elva's family.
Right, that's the white lady.
So in the file, that's how we discovered what Nona's real name was. Here's another thing that happened. Okay, so now I need to find her family. It was second marriages for both of them. They did not have children together. And it was a later in life marriage. I was trying to find the Lisk family. And I knew that they must have, at some point they were in New York and blah, 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 right? And so I discover that there's a member of the Lisk family out in Breezy Point. And I actually have family members who live out in Breezy Point. And so I thought, oh, maybe I'll have to get them to knock on their door, right? So Ancestry, I discovered that they were there because the Lisk family tree was on Ancestry, right? So I went on Ancestry, and there's a function where you can send an email, you send a message, but no one ever checks it. So once a year, like a pilgrimage, I would just send an email to, it was like MJ Seal Ray is what they call themselves, right? And I was like, how am I ever gonna get? So every year I would do this. Finally, my aunt, who's a Long Island housewife, said, oh, why don't you just Google it? And I was like, I can't do that. I tell my undergrads, you can't just Google something. You have to do the research. You have to go to the archives. Well, she got the phone number from Google. I just shrank in that moment, right? So it all goes to show that actually no stone unturned, turn every page, whatever those metaphors are. Yeah, no stone unturned. You need to, yes, do the research, go to the archives, but of course, do a Google search as well.
Great. So you actually have many follow-up articles you could write. You could be in touch with the Lisk family and see what they think about the book.
True. So the Lisk family, when I did find them, they did end up telling me things about Aunt Elva that were part of the secret that she was harboring. And I will say that because of the secret that she was harboring, it was actually the reason for why she and Uncle Deck were able to get married and she was not disowned by her white family. This is a period in time in which, I'll take it. This is a period in time in which families often disowned their daughters for marrying outside the race, right? But it was very significant that they didn't.
And while you're dealing with that, I'll just add, and women were stripped of their U.S. citizenship if they married someone like your great uncle. So this is a big deal to do something like that, legally, socially, culturally, possibly economically. You have to read the book to find out what the secret is. Okay, tell us about the photos. So you mentioned the photos. You've got all these photos, really old photos. Where'd you get them?
Most of them were from my grandmother's family albums. Then I started asking other family members for photographs, and then they sent it to me. Then some of the photographs are from the Chinese Exclusion Act files on the different family members. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. eBay, postcards. I have a photograph. I was able to get postcards of all of the ships that my family members, sailed in on.
How about your father's campaign ad?
Yeah. So my dad...
He ran for office.
He ran for office in the early 70s, and he gave that to me, actually. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. All right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, it's not like he didn't help me with this book. Mm-hmm. Maybe he regrets it, but he did help me when I was working on it.
Right. That's great. We have time for one last question, and then we'll turn to the audience for your questions. So when we prepped for this, we chatted a little bit about how in the past few years, all these books have come out. It's amazing. All these Asian American authors have done memoirs, have done novels. So I did a book 24 years ago. It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And
pioneer.
Yeah. Well, that just means I'm old. In part, I wrote the book with some of the same motivation that you had, which is the book didn't exist. So my book came out of an undergraduate project that I started, went to the library, looking for a book like the one I would eventually write, but it didn't exist. So
Was this when you were at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah. So,
I know that library.
So I wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
But what's amazing is, even though I try to be a scholar in this field, because I have a day job, I'm 100 books behind, at least, in following what's been going on. Talk to us about all these memoirs, novels, Is it good? Is it bad? Are you reading them? What do you think? Is this a moment? Is it a fad?
I think it's amazing. I do not think it's a fad. It is a moment. But, you know, I kind of look at it a little bit like what was happening with the proliferation of wonderful, amazing African-American books that were coming out right around 10 years ago, within the last 10 years. It's not a fad. There have been these writers out there writing for a very long time. It's just that the gatekeepers in publishing only just recognize it, right? And then, you know, give award contracts, right? Book contracts. But, you know, there are writers of every stripe that are out there whose stories need to be told, whose stories that we need to hear.
That's right. If you poke around, there were Asian American memoirists a century ago.
Oh, yeah.
They're obscure.
Yeah.
They were publishing
Yeah.
a century ago.
So I'll tell you that one of the things that motivated me was so both the president and I went to Johns Hopkins and we're in the same program at the writing seminars, different times. He was an undergrad, I was a graduate student. One of the other grad students, former grad students from the program, was the great historian Iris Chang.
Yes, I knew her.
So Iris, was she there at the time when you were there?
You're both younger than I am. She tragically died must be 20 years ago now.
Yeah, or in the 2000s.
She was there a few years after I was.
So Iris was there maybe about 10 years before or something like that.
Yeah.
And I knew her work. She wrote the book, The Rape of Nanjing. She was just an amazing young historian. And when we had corresponded about her book, The Chinese Americans. Right. But I knew at the time when she was working on her book that I was going to be working on doing Mott Street. I just didn't know what the iteration was. So she was looking for materials for her book, but we had conversations. But then I didn't meet her in person until I was a graduate student at USC. After I did my master's, I did my PhD. So some of you, if you go on to the master's program here, the MFA program here, you can also think about the PhD if you're interested in that. That's what I ended up doing. And I met Iris at the LA Times Book Festival. And I told her about one of the iterations of Mott Street was as a novel. So I was a fiction writer as well. And so I told Iris about the book, and she was like, Ava, we need more Chinese American stories out there, right? We need more of your stories. And I always remember that Iris said that to me. Mm-hmm. And so I say that to you, young writers out there. We need your stories out there, right? They need to be told.
Right. There are many, many more stories yet to be written.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some time for audience Q&A.
I know you're also a teacher. So
yes.
My question to you is, how do you bring your awareness of the reader to your writing as a teacher?
Okay, so how do I bring my awareness of the reader
to your writing,
to my writing,
and then teach that?
And then teach that to my students.
Yes,
Audience, right. Okay, got it. So I am, thanks, Lori. I am a professor of creative writing. I teach at the College of Staten Island. I also teach in the program of biography and memoir at the Graduate Center, just like our esteemed professor over here, Jason. And the question of audience is always central. And for a very long time, I thought, well, who am I writing this book for, right? And because this book took so many different iterations, I think it was sort of changing in my mind, right? And I'll tell you, the other thing is that, I'll just tell you this little bit about myself as a writer. Because this book took so many years to write, one of the things I always do, because I'm a visual person. I was an English major, but I was also an art minor. And so one of the things I like to do was to use images in the work and for myself. So again, the work that I created in Betty Weidman's class was a giant folio with images in it. Then when I was working on this book, I created this board that had all of these images of the different family members, so I could remember who were the central characters that I needed to, and what were their stories that would help move the story along, right? And at the center of it all, staring out at all of these folks, I put an image of my daughter from behind, staring out at all of the ancestors. And so I think ultimately, the reader is you, the reader is me, but it was also, I had the idea that future generations needed to understand this legacy of what it means to be Chinese in America after, this period in time in which in the 19th century, we didn't actually talk about this, but in the 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Act is born, right? So one of the things I had to ask myself is, well, why? What were the reasons for it? What was happening in the country at that time that fomented, the sudden closing of the border against one nationality and ethnicity that was then used to create other iterations of exclusion against other people from other countries? It took me a really long time to figure this out, I have to tell you. But what I realized is that after the railroad was completed, there was a great economic depression. They used to call it the Great Depression until the Great Depression of the 20th century. And there was a run on banks, and then all of a sudden, there was this animosity towards the Chinese workers that had helped build the railroad, like my great-great-grandfather. And what ends up happening on the West Coast is that West Coast politicians who had their anti-Chinese sentiment, and they rode it to popularity. This is a great wave of populism against the other, right? This immigrant group, this particular immigrant group. This is the era of Reconstruction after 1869. And so what happens is these West Coast politicians work hand in hand with Southern politicians intent upon maintaining supremacy, and they work towards creating the first longest-running immigration restriction in our country, right? And at the same time, slavery becomes segregation, right? And Chinese exclusion is born. So this is a period in time in which the country was asking itself, who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? And then for Asian Americans, this is really particularly an important lesson, because anytime you're asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? The iterations of the exclusion go way back to the 19th century. That's its roots. It's not because you're a first-generation immigrant or your parents came over. It's not because of that. It has great historical roots during this particular period in time. And unless we look at this, right, we are doomed to repeat the cycle. One of the things I noticed is that different iterations of Chinese exclusion kept cropping up during what periods of time? Election years and midterm elections. The idea of keeping an immigrant group out is so powerful in terms of galvanizing votes, that these are the things that politicians, it's easy for politicians to work that angle, to gather these votes because of these knee-jerk populist reactions. And it continues to today.
There's a question on Zoom asking how you persevere through, what allows you to persevere through writer's block?
We all have writer's block. There were many times where I felt when I was in the archives, some of the archives, because some of the research materials I was looking at were articles from the 19th century, newspaper articles that reflect the bias and discrimination of the day, there were so many times where it felt like it was a gut punch every time I opened up a file. And those were moments where I had to just acknowledge what I was reading. And I had to learn how to read against the grain, against these files, right? And I had to learn to just take care of myself and step away from the files when necessary. But writer's block happens even if you don't have very thorny archives that seem to be against people who look like you, right? And I think that's a struggle for anybody, but I will tell you this. At my writing desk at home, and I'm fortunate. I have a studio on Mott Street in the building that my family members lived in for generations. But I also have a desk at home that I write at. On my desk is a chapbook by Kamiko Han. It says, "Write it." And every time I felt like just going to sleep or just eating more snacks or just, answering emails, there was Kamiko's chapbook. "Write it," reminding me what I needed to do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The history is just so fascinating. So thank you, and the personal history and the background. I'm curious what the response has been from people who are not from the Asian American community. What sort of like, "Oh, my parents have secrets too," or what are sort of general responses?
It runs the gamut. Mostly, the people who come up to me really do love the book and they feel connected to it because of these common themes of immigration, landing in New York. This is very much of a New York story as well. Folks who love New York City history, and history of the Lower East Side, really respond to it. And often I get I'm not Chinese American or Asian American, but I still felt a connection to your work for these reasons. There are others who I've encountered, including local radio disc jockeys who are like, come on, didn't this happen to everybody? When are we going to get over this, blah, 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 right? I've had to deal with people like that too. And I have to say, no. Most people don't know about this history. And this is why we need to know about it, right? In literature, it's through these stories that we get to understand how interconnected we are, right? The ways in which we're interconnected. And also in literature, how else, aside from literature, are you going to really learn about the experiences of other people who don't look exactly like you, right? For most people, that doesn't exclude, we're New Yorkers. We've got lots of, across the board. But for your average American, it is really through literature that you're going to learn about other people's lived experiences. So that's why it's really important for those of you undergrads who are interested in telling your stories that you start now. You start asking those questions now. My grandparents have long since passed. But it was, that work that I did as a junior right here that really helped me to write this book, as I said. So thanks for the question, Kamiko.
I want to close by thanking both President Wu and Professor Chin for your wonderful thoughts and writing, and very wonderful and informative, I want to say, thoughts and writing. I want to thank the Godwin Turnbach Museum for allowing us to host the event here. And as President Wu said, the bookstore Q and Willow is selling books just out in the foyer.
In the vestibule.
Vestibule, yes, thank you.
And I'm happy to sign.
And yes, there will be a signing. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.